On an empty stretch of the Great Western Highway, 100 miles west of Sydney, Australia, Sergeant Brown and Constable Cross noticed the headlights of a parked car shining through the night under a thicket of eucalyptus trees. The time is 4:20 a.m. The date, January 27th, 1980. The policemen approach a silver Mercedes-Benz. Inside, they find a dead man, a military rifle in his hand, lots of blood on his head. Blood on the console, the seats, the floor wells, the windows. Officers Brown and Cross report that nothing seemed suspicious in the way the body was positioned, slumped forward on the dashboard. They trace the trajectory from the rifle through the victim's head to the bullet hole in the roof of the car, and the points align. They find a handwritten note that may or may not read as a farewell message. The victim's briefcase contains a list, scores of typed names, prominent Australians, political, sports, business, and entertainment personalities. Oh, and drug dealers. 26 drug dealers. Next to each name, a dollar amount, mostly 5- and 6-figure sums. Opening the victim's wallet, the officers determine that his name is Frank Nugan, a resident of Sydney Harbour, a 2-hour drive away. No one heard the gunshot, yet it would resonate all the way to the Australian Parliament and the White House, reverberating in a scandal that should have been bigger than the Banco Ambrosiano in Europe, bigger than the Iran-Contra debacle in Washington, D.C. And yet chances are that, unless you were living in Australia at the time, you've never heard of it. It's a tale of black money, white powder, and green berets. The tale of a bank robbery where the bank, after hijacking its patrons, pretty much managed to rob itself. It all starts with the crime scene. Why are there no prints on the weapon? Why don't the police fingerprint the body? If the victim fired the fatal shot himself, why did he drive for 2 hours before it, when he could have found privacy 10 minutes away from his house? What were 2 police officers even doing there, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night? And what's this piece of paper? Tucked inside a Bible, the officers find a torn fragment of a meat pie bag. It bears the handwritten names of Bob Wilson and William Colby. Bob Wilson is the ranking Republican on the U.S. House of Representatives Armed Service Committee. William Colby is a lawyer, but not just any lawyer. After commanding the CIA's station in Saigon, running all U.S. intelligence operations during the Vietnam War, he became director of the CIA. The cops don't know that. To them, the scene looks like a straightforward self-inflicted death, but the victim isn't a straightforward victim. Frank Nugan is a banker, at the head of an international bank holding. He's got connections. The justice system needs answers. 4 months after the discovery of Frank Nugan's body in his silver Mercedes, the inquiry hears witnesses. Michael Hand, a charismatic American in his late 30s, testifies. Back in 1973 in Sydney, he co-founded a bank with the deceased. They christened it after their 2 surnames, the Nugan Hand Bank. Hand is a 50% shareholder in the bank. Pressed by investigators to clarify the state of the bank, Michael Hand reveals that none of their depositors will ever see a cent of their money again. The Nugan Hand Bank is insolvent. Between the bank's main offices in Sydney and their subsidiaries worldwide, unpayable claims mount to $50 million, and that's only the claim deposits. Some people may not want to come out in the open and ask for their money back. More on that in a bit. All told, we may be talking hundreds of millions of US dollars of debt. Multiply by 12 to adjust for inflation. The bank, which believably claimed to move $1 billion a year, is currently unable to pay the $20,000 rent for their Sydney headquarters. At the inquest, Michael Hand blames the misappropriation of funds on the dearly departed. He says Frank Nugan took some money for himself and lent the rest, with very little to no paper trail, a $50 million debt. That is motive enough for Mr. Nugan to end his own life, isn't it? Surely, say the insurance companies. Not at all, says Michael Hand. Nugan was a fighter, he claims. But wasn't Nugan about to get indicted for stock fraud in a separate case? Hand waves this concern aside. He insists his partner was murdered. Insurance company lawyers revealed that the Nugan Hand Bank transferred large amounts of money from Australia to Hong Kong, in secret and in apparent violation of exchange control and tax regulations. Once more, Hand blames it on the dead man. He, Michael Hand, was just following orders. But nothing could be further from the truth. I'm your host, Tor Parsons. These are my co-hosts, Jollibee the Durian, Siegfried the Slug, and Thimble the Doll, and welcome to Tor's Cabinet of Curiosities.
man your battle station. Will you give them all your time? We all feel the same frustration and hope to guide you on our side. Are you coming home to stay? Or you spend this winter driving me insane?
The day after Frank Nugan is found dead, January 28, 1980, is Australia Day weekend, a public holiday. All offices are closed. Still, Nugan's longtime secretary gets a call from a vice president of the bank. Report to work. Stat. Here starts Phase 1 of the cover-up. Arriving at the office, the secretary finds an interesting cast of characters. There's the VP who called her. There's Dennis Pittard, a retired rugby star who acts as a goodwill ambassador for Nugan Hand. And there's Ken Nugan, the deceased's brother. The secretary is told to retrieve any incriminating paperwork. She doesn't know where to start. It's a 90-minute job of ripping pages off, destroying ledgers, bagging documents. The motley crew acts hurriedly, worried that the police may show up any minute. They shouldn't have worried. The police don't even show up the next day, when a more high-profile and methodical team meets at the office to finish the job. Among the Phase 2 team, emptying the shelves, we find Michael Hand, the 50-50 partner. Working alongside him is Buddy Yates. I'm sorry, that's Rear Admiral Earl P. Yates to you. The former commander of the aircraft carrier USS John F. Kennedy, he became Chief of Staff for Plans and Policy for the U.S. Pacific Command. That put him in charge of all strategic planning from California to the Persian Gulf until he retired in 1974. What on earth is this guy doing, ransacking a Sydney bank office? Well, 3 years back, Yates became president of the Nugan Hand Bank. And he's not even the most important character in this story. That title may go to the most mysterious man joining the second cover-up team. His name is Bernie Houghton. Another veteran of World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, his official occupation in Australia is managing a nudie bar in the red light district of Sydney. The man is so secretive about his past that when he hired a lawyer to draw his will, he wouldn't even say if he had wives or children. Bernie Houghton. Remember that name. The Phase 2 cleanup operation goes smoothly. Enough documents to fill a small room are fed into a shredder. More documents get packed into a van and driven to the cold storage room of a butcher's shop. Now the entrails of the defunct bank rest among hanging lamb carcasses. Then, Hand testifies that the bank is insolvent. Its Hong Kong office announces they suspend paying depositors. News of the bank's failure echoes around the financial world. Wall Street Journal reporters Seth Lipsky and Jim Browning start investigating. They uncover some other employees of Nugan Hand. Brigadier General Earl Koch Jr., heading the bank's Washington, D.C. office, of Brigadier General Edwin Black, the bank's Hawaii representative, of a CIA Deputy Director for Economic Research, a CIA think tank advisor with personal access to Henry Kissinger, the former CIA station chief in Bangkok, and more. Enough decorated military personnel to run a small war. Enough spooks to win one. How completely unremarkable that these lovely people came to work for a Sydney banking establishment run by two guys with exactly zero banking qualifications. I say we take a closer look at those qualifications. Michael Hand was born into war. On the day of his birth, December 8, 1941, President Roosevelt gave his Day of Infamy speech. Hand grows up in the Bronx, at a time when his neighborhood is still upper middle class. Raised a Christian Scientist, he is smooth and mild-mannered with a prize-winning smile. He studies forestry to become a forest ranger. In May 1963, he joins the Army. Soon, he is selected for Special Forces training with the elite Green Berets at Fort Bragg. In February 1965, the U.S. begins a campaign of sustained bombing raids in North Vietnam. In the south, Michael Hand, now a radio operator, arrives in Tai Nguyen province. The narrative of his wartime adventures reads like a scene from Platoon. 1,500 North Vietnamese attack his compound at Daan Xoai. They're armed with heavy mortar, machine guns, and flamethrowers. Among the last Americans standing, Hand and his lieutenant retreat all the way to an artillery pit. The radio battery dies, and now they're out of ammunition. Knowing he will die soon, armed only with his ordnance K-bar knife, Michael Hand has a Rambo moment. he goes sicko mode. He launches himself out of the pit and kills everyone approaching him, and it's not pretty. One of his comrades reports that after mortally stabbing an enemy, Hand grabs the guy's head and separates it clear from his body. Hit twice by mortar shrapnel, he is ordered to withdraw, yet when the helicopters arrive, he returns under fire to rescue another wounded man. All told, he retrieves 4 of his comrades. Hand won a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, and the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military award. That's who we're dealing with. After the war, Michael Hand goes to work for the CIA in Laos. He trains the Hmong, an ethnic group who in Laos live on prime poppy land. They trade military support from the US, as in weapons and training, for opium, and later heroin. Officially, the US is supporting them so the Hmong can stop a possible communist insurgency in Laos. Sure. That doesn't say what the CIA does with all the dope they get in exchange. Evidence collected by Alfred McCoy in his book The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia suggests a two-pronged answer. Drugs were given to American soldiers in Vietnam, 11% of whom came home with a heroin habit, and drugs were sold on US and European soil in order to buy weapons with the proceeds. That the CIA sold drugs is disputed. What's not disputed is that they armed and protected Laotian drug lords. Then, Hand goes down under. He arrives in Australia 8 months after a 48-year-old nondescript American barkeep, Bernie Houghton. Nearly everyone involved in this story is worthy of the epithet International Man of Mystery, but if just one person has to be called that, it's Houghton. Secretive as he was, Bernie Houghton couldn't help but leave a few breadcrumbs. During the Vietnam War, Houghton was a key player in the very discreet yet very regular flights between the US and the Golden Triangle, the border region between Laos, Myanmar, and Thailand. Mountainous, remote, populated by ethnic minorities who don't trust their government, and full of unguarded borders that can be hopped if things go bad, the Golden Triangle has been effectively ruled by drug lords since at least World War II. Most of the world's heroin still comes from there. In the 1970s, airlines bearing the names of Air America, Civil Air Transport, Southern Airways, and Paragon Services brought in anything from military support to agricultural machinery to slot machines. Alan Parks, a retired Air Force colonel, remembers that Houghton ferried C-47s. Those are American-made cargo and troop transport planes. His main route was between Thailand, where he was based, and Australia. He didn't own an airline. You could say he flew under the radar. Rumors of CIA dealings in the Golden Triangle continued way into the 1970s, yet Houghton quit his airborne operations in 1967. Had he found a better business opportunity? The only interview Houghton ever gave that we know of was to the Australian Joint Task Force on Drug Trafficking. This interview reads like a masterclass on the art of not answering questions. Houghton muddles facts and gets dates wrong. He claims, for instance, that he opened his Sydney nudie bar in early November of 1967. The task force determines that the actual date was 2 months prior. And that's interesting. It has to do with Sydney being a stop for Vietnam soldiers on a break. In 1967, American forces took rest and recreation periods, R&R, on Uncle Sam's dime in Bangkok and Hong Kong. The clubs and brothels there became so overcrowded that the US government negotiated a deal with Australia. Sydney would open its doors to US soldiers. Bars targeting American GIs would offer American-style food, liquor, and entertainment at discounted prices for the troops. The first boys arrive in Sydney early in October of 1967. They're told the area called King's Cross is where they'll find everything necessary for a fine week's vacation from killing. The Bourbon and Beefsteak, Bernie Houghton's establishment in King's Cross, is already open by then. Houghton would never say how he knew about that golden opportunity, a business niche estimated at $9 million per month for Sydney alone, but he must have been tipped off. The US Army had an urgent need for this kind of establishment, a need the Australian bars couldn't quite fulfill in the same way. Bernie Houghton was not in the least experienced in this line of work, but it's not rocket surgery. Soon, the Bourbon and Beefsteak overflows with soldiers. Houghton opens 2 more bars nearby, the Texas Tavern and Harpoon Harry's. Houghton becomes more visible. It's not unusual for him to be helicoptered out to US ships to greet his future customers. Bernie Houghton is nothing if not well connected. He arrives in Sydney supposedly penniless and knowing nobody, yet a couple of weeks later he's wining and dining with Sir Paul Strasser, Knight of the Realm, Sydney's #1 real estate tycoon. Sir Paul considers hiring Houghton for his real estate business, but he would like references. Houghton names 2 high-ranking army figures, Admiral Yates one of them. They give Houghton glowing references. Sir Paul notices that at US embassy parties, Houghton introduces Yates to all the top people. not the other way around. Again, we're talking about a man whose official business is to serve weak beer and thin, greasy steaks to American soldiers in a dimly lit establishment that advertises clothing-challenged ladies doing unusual stuff with ping-pong balls. Where has Houghton been before? And now, he's supervising the destruction of files in a Sydney bank. We're in April of 1980, 4 months after Frank Nugan was found dead, and Michael Hand, following his testimony, has placed Nugan Hand under the protection of a bankruptcy court. At the end of June, both Hand and Bernie Houghton have left Australia to undisclosed locations. Still, it's only in early July that the court appoints a liquidator. His name is John O'Brien. His mission? To delve into Nugan Hand books and find what happened to the missing $50 million. John O'Brien is an independent liquidator, specializing in bankruptcy. Looking into the ever-growing pile of bills, he notices one for $45,684.09. The creditor is one William Colby, former head of the CIA, and former supervisor of Michael Hand, as he trained the Hmong warriors in Laos. Attached to the bill is a letter from Colby himself. He explains that the bill, quote, represents a summarization of the various activities that we did for Frank, meaning Frank Nugan, and separately for you, over the past several months. These activities, according to the letter, mainly involved, quote, a general consulting relationship on various matters involving United States law. Legalese is not an exact tongue, but in light of everything else, this certainly seemed to translate into, we tell you how to avoid being indicted for your illegal yet very useful activities. As he plows through whatever is left of the Nugan Hand books, O'Brien becomes convinced that not all the brains of the operation ended up splattered onto the roof of Nugan's Mercedes. O'Brien is apparently very good at his job. He follows the money. He notices irregularities in the bank's tax counseling activities. On paper, it's perfectly legal to ask for advice in order to pay as few taxes as possible. That's what tax advisors are for. But they're not supposed to help you defraud the tax man. O'Brien discovers a collection of schemes by which the bank did exactly that on a regular basis. We'll take a look at those shortly. O'Brien evaluates the bank's assets. That's securities worth millions of dollars in highly rated commercial banking instruments. They guarantee that the bank can pay depositors when they withdraw their money. If push comes to shove, just sell the assets. O'Brien realizes that these assets simply do not exist and never have. The billion-dollar bank was built on sand. Now they owe $50 million, probably much more, and whatever money was in their accounts before the death of Frank Nugan has vanished. Who else knew? That's the main question on O'Brien's mind. It would become a central question in the case. Among the high-ranking military operatives and the intelligence professionals, who knew how humongous a fraud they were perpetrating? You see, there's no good answer to the question. Say you recently supervised billions of dollars in US taxpayer funds by managing whole fleets of jets and aircraft carriers, involving being entrusted with nuclear weapons, and the specialty of the department you were running is, of all things, intelligence. If you spent more than a month working at Nugan Hand and you claim to have not realized that they were embezzling millions, you're either a bold, barefaced liar or the biggest, ripest, juiciest idiot born yesterday. And the US military employed at their highest and most sensitive strategic positions either a curated selection of world-class cretins or a gang of thieves now living their best lives off the riches of defrauded investors. Unless, if neither of those things are true, and honestly they probably aren't on the whole, then someone else is directing the bank's criminal activities. The bill from William Colby alerts O'Brien to who that might have been. His concerns are made more acute by the scandal of national magnitude that surrounded the fall of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. Side story time. In my recent episode about the Deseret script, I talked about everyone's favorite example of berserk English spelling rules, the numerous ways O-U-G-H can be pronounced. Everyone knows that's a mess. If I was an evil parent, and I wanted to make sure that nobody would ever correctly pronounce the name of my son, I wouldn't name him something obviously daunting like that volcanic respiratory disease that nerdy 12-year-old boys know how to pronounce. I wouldn't pull some dumb bullshit like the Swedish parents who named their kid this, but insisted it was pronounced Albin. I would name my child something deceptively simple, something that isn't a recognized word or common name, but hinges on the most annoying string in the English language, O-U-G-H. Like this famous, influential Prime Minister of Australia. I can read that as Gow, Go, Goo, Guff, Guh, Gug, Gog, Guck, or Gov, all of which are terrible names, but it must be one of those, and not a single one of those leaps out at me as more correct than the others. Apparently he pronounced it Gough, as in the thing that Ennaby Darkness Dementia Raven Way is. Anyway, I'd heard of Whitlam before, because of his role in what may well be the most controversial episode in Australian political history. Let's get filled in. Back in 1968, the USA had opened a base in Australia near Alice Springs. Known as Pine Gap, it may have been the largest US base abroad, and it was certainly among the most restricted. Pine Gap was pitched to the Australian people as part of the American space program, a believable claim with the moon landing a year in the distance, but in reality the base relayed information from spy satellites stationed over the Soviet Union, China, and Europe, and it transferred orders from the Pentagon to the US nuclear submarine fleet in Asian waters. Some Australians just don't buy the sales pitch. One of them is the newly elected Prime Minister in 1972, Gough Whitlam. He's from the Labour Party, which does not make him a rabid communist. Actually, he's more moderate than many of his colleagues on international issues, but he's the first Labour Prime Minister to win in Australia in almost a quarter century, and the CIA says he heads up, quote, a left-wing and possibly antagonistic government. Whitlam believes it's the right of the Australian people to know if the Pine Gap base would make Australia a target in the event of a nuclear war with the USSR. The UN Non-Proliferation Treaty on Nuclear Weapons was only signed 4 years ago, and the Cold War is yet to cool down. Whitlam's term is marked by the institution of universal health care and free college education, but 2 years into his mandate, Whitlam's administration is damaged by scandals involving illegal loans from Pakistan that forced the resignation of 2 of his ministers. The 1973 oil crisis makes the public lose even more confidence. Whitlam and his attorney general fight back. They begin to overhaul ASIO, their intelligence service. On November 2, 1975, Whitlam publicly states that the CIA is funding his opposition party, the Liberal Country Coalition, and he doxes at least 4 undercover CIA agents on Australian soil. An important date is coming up. December 9th, a month after this statement, is when the agreement regarding the Pine Gap base would be renewed. Whitlam never spoke a word against Pine Gap, but his statements made a lot of people nervous, and after the scandals, his popularity was dwindling. Meanwhile, he's struggling to get his agenda through Parliament. The Australian Senate, which is less powerful than the US Senate, but is still non-proportional and capable of blocking legislation, is controlled by the opposition. They had blocked Whitlam's funding bills throughout his premiership, something Australia's Senate had never done before, even in previous cases of divided government. Whitlam had responded with another unprecedented move, invoking an obscure article of the Australian Constitution to call a joint sitting, effectively merging the larger Labour-majority House of Representatives and the smaller coalition-majority Senate into a single legislature for a few days, giving Whitlam the majority he needed to pass his healthcare and election reform bills. It was a victory for our friend Gough, but it couldn't last. The aforementioned loan scandal leads to the resignation of a handful of Labour Party senators. Another Labour senator has a heart attack in his office and dies. Lance Barnard, Whitlam's former deputy prime minister, also resigns from his Senate seat to accept an ambassadorship Whitlam offered him. Barnard serves in a safe seat for Labour, so it's expected an ally of Whitlam will win the special election to succeed him. Nope. With the scandal and the state of the economy, the coalition sweeps the special elections. Now, Labour doesn't have enough seats to pass legislation even if Whitlam calls a joint session. The coalition refuses to let Whitlam's budget pass. There's no such thing as a government shutdown in Australian law. Something has to give. On November 11th, 1975, Governor-General John Kerr makes a decision. The post of Australia's Governor-General, which also exists in Canada, New Zealand, and a handful of other Commonwealth countries, is a throwback to the old days of the British Empire. Officially, the Governor-General is the representative of the British monarch, who is still the de jure head of state of Australia. Fun fact, later in the 1990s, Australia held a referendum on abolishing monarchy, and it failed, so technically Australia is the only country to have voted for the British royal family. Through the Governor-General, Australia continues to enjoy such benefits as knighthoods and royal commissions. As an apparent gesture of appeasement towards those who doubted his ideological associations, Whitlam had nominated the conservative John Kerr, Chief Justice of New South Wales, to the mostly ceremonial position. Mostly. One of the powers of the Governor-General, granted to him by the Constitution, was to name and revoke the Prime Minister. Yes, that's right. The Prime Minister names the Governor-General, and the Governor-General, supposedly, on paper, names the Prime Minister. The latter isn't really true in practice. The Prime Minister wins a democratic election, and then the GG swears in the winner of the election. But technically, They don't have to swear in the winner. Kerr had long-standing ties with the CIA. They paid for his travels and even published his writings. That interesting bit of sponsorship had been exposed by the US Congress, which didn't stop Kerr from going to the CIA for money. On November 11th, 1975, Governor General Kerr took the decision to remove the regularly elected Whitlam from office and appointed opposition leader Malcolm Fraser in his place. A constitutional coup. To this day, Australian democracy's darkest hour. Fraser immediately declared a general election, which he won in a landslide, given Whitlam's unpopularity. That smoothed things over with the public. Now the Prime Minister had a popular mandate again, but the legality of the dismissal is still debated to this day, and it was a major constitutional crisis at the time. When Liquidator John O'Brien discovered the CIA's fingerprints all over the Nugan Hand books, that story and its implication that the CIA manipulates the highest powers down under was still fresh in the minds of the Australian public. John O'Brien is not one to mince his words. In a TV interview, he declares, "There's no doubt Nugan Hand was involved in laundering of money and tax evasion schemes, and there is no doubt Nugan Hand people had military backgrounds and links at a high level with American intelligence organizations." A few days later, on a warm sunny day, Mr. O'Brien is asked to meet with two men in very heavy overcoats. They're Americans. They'd like to know what he knows. O'Brien would like them to please turn over their documentation. He receives documents so thoroughly redacted that there's not a single complete sentence left. Mr. O'Brien has little taste for official obfuscation. He writes to the Prime Minister of Australia, still Malcolm Fraser. He requires the government's help in approaching the FBI and other American agencies. Consequently, the Prime Minister's office, quote, decided to seek a U.S. government statement refuting claims that Nugan Hand was in any way involved with relations with the CIA. Let me unpack this. The Prime Minister does not order an inquest into the Australian bank's ties with American intelligence. He does not grant O'Brien powers of investigation. He does not ask his own intelligence service. Rather, he jumps straight to the conclusion that there is nothing to see here, and he asks the U.S. for corroboration. Too happy that the government of Australia is doing their job for them, the U.S. Embassy indicates that, quote, there would be no difficulty in providing that statement.
Oh, you betcha, yeah.
Yeah.
John O'Brien has proof of the bank's ties with the CIA, and despite the books being cooked to Michelin star levels, he has proof the bank was engaged in fraud. But he pretty much has to stop there. He doesn't know the extent of the relationship between the bank and the CIA. He can't prove the magnitude of the fraud. He has no idea of the staggering number of crimes yet to come to light. To find our way into this maze of a plot, we need to follow the main characters. Now that we know at least a little more about Michael Hand and Bernie Houghton, that leaves the question you might have been asking yourselves. The story of Frank Nugan starts in muddy waters. His parents claim to be Spanish immigrants who married in Madrid in 1930 and settled in Australia in 1938. In reality, Albert and Anneliese Neugarten were German immigrants who married in Jerusalem in December of 1938. They arrived in Australia in 1939 and changed their name to Nugan. Mr. and Mrs. Nugan put roots down in Griffith, a farming town 350 miles west of Sydney. In the mind of the average Australian, Griffith is associated with agriculture, fruits, vegetables, wine, and, quite illegally, marijuana. Sometime around 1941, Nugan Sr. starts what would become the largest fruit and veg packing business in the area. Of his 3 children, 2 are of interest to us. Frank Nugan, the man in the Mercedes, and his brother Ken, who would take over the produce business. According to Ken Nugan, the U.S. government is one of their main clients. The Nugan Fruit Group supplies the massive U.S. Navy base at Subic Bay in the Philippines with fresh produce. It may be on the up and up. Whether the containers of grapefruits and carrots also included dried leaves of the fun kind is not documented. Frank Nugan is born on January 29, 1943. He grows up into a big guy, sometimes described as a 600-pound gorilla, with a temper to match and reeking of cigar smoke. He gets a law degree from Sydney University in 1963. Then he moves to the US. At UC Berkeley, in 1965, he obtains a Master of Laws degree. That's a degree most lawyers don't think worth their trouble. Nugan supposedly reads tax law in California, but according to one of his teachers, Nugan is a playboy type, majoring in Jaguar XKE with a minor in glider planes. He never even studied tax law. Then, Nugan and his Jaguar are off to Toronto, where he studies for the even more arcane degree of Doctor of Laws, which he does not get. He would later claim he had a major hand in rewriting Canadian tax law, but by all accounts his job with the task force was merely clerical. He's back in Sydney in 1969. That's when Nugan meets Michael Hand. They meet at the Bourbon and Beefsteak. For both of them, the bar serves as headquarters and hunting grounds. Michael Hand is trying to make it in real estate. He pushes blocks of seaside land to soldiers eager to invest their pay. Meanwhile, Nugan advertises his supposed skills as a tax avoidance lawyer. Legend has it that Hand and Nugan had separately made millions in real estate and mining trades before launching their banking venture. They had indeed tried their luck at investing in real estate and nickel mines, but the paperwork shows very limited success. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars, possibly as much as $100,000 altogether for both men in 2 years. Absolutely not millions. None of their ventures show investing genius or anything like banking savviness. A lawyer from DC who worked with Hand in real estate commented that Michael Hand running a bank was, quote, like hearing my brother had become a ballet dancer. It didn't make sense. He had no education in banking. And yet, on June 25th, 1973, the investment bank of Nugan Hand Limited is incorporated in Sydney. They set up office on Macquarie Street, a prestige address half a mile from the Sydney Opera House with a view of Harbour Bridge. There's a third partner, one John Needham. He would leave the bank after a year, worried that he couldn't obtain any information on the company's activities. At the time, Frank Nugan has less than $20,000 in his bank account. He writes a check for $1 million to the bank, and to cover it, he purports to borrow an equal sum from the bank. That phantom million he never paid back seems to have been the starting capital of Nugan Hand. Things really take off a year later. A mutual fund, the Dollar Fund of Australia, stops redeeming its shares, meaning they evaporate with the money, leaving their depositors holding an empty bag. Within a few months, several members of its sales force join Nugan Hand. One of them opens the Honolulu branch, their first overseas operation, in August 1974. Another one, in January of 1975, opens the Hong Kong subsidiary. 18 months after founding the bank, Michael Hand claims he's had enough of corporate life, of offices and suits and ties. In early 1975, the staff hear the bad news. Hand has resigned from the bank. He's going into turkey farming. Turns out the former Green Beret has a singular interpretation of turkey farming. He's going to Africa, a continent remarkably devoid of turkeys. In the 1970s, Africa is a tumultuous place. By then, Britain and France have given up most of their colonies on the continent, sometimes willingly, sometimes after decades of war and insurgency made it the only option left. Countries are declaring independence, fighting opposition, changing names. Wars don't end when the whites go home. After all, most of Africa's borders were arbitrarily drawn by European powers in the first place, forcing tribes with centuries-long rivalries into the same country, and now they no longer have a common enemy. The great powers couldn't care less who rules their former African colonies when they're gone. They just want to get the hell out of there. Colonialism, after all, was expensive. Contrary to the popular stereotype, European powers usually spent more money defending their colonies than they ever got out of those countries' resources. It was really mostly undertaken for national prestige reasons. But because Europe didn't care who took their place, in some places, white rule didn't end when colonial rule did. In the southern part of the continent, the formerly British country of Rhodesia, soon to become Zimbabwe, is run by a white man named Ian Smith. The situation, as everywhere in Africa, is crazy intricate, but let me give you the cliff notes. Smith rules with the support of the 250,000-strong white minority, claiming that the black folks are not sophisticated enough to vote. Unsurprisingly, some citizens disagree with a democracy that excludes the 6 million black people living in the country. Smith calls for international help. He doles out massive payments to white people willing to move to Rhodesia from the US and Europe. He tries to prove that Great Zimbabwe, a majestic ruined city from the 13th century, can't have been built by native Zimbabweans. He declares that his two main opponents, Joshua Nkomo and Robert Mugabe, are Kremlin-controlled communists. Nkomo is indeed receiving funding from the USSR, Mugabe is being funded by China, but what they really are is tribal leaders, Nkomo for the Ndebele, Mugabe for the Shona. They won't turn down some foreign support, but it's not what's making them fight. But the single word of communist is enough to get him quiet, unofficial support from the US. Pretty much the same thing happens next in Angola, west of Rhodesia, a former Portuguese colony. Portugal has been holding on to Angola until, back home in Lisbon, their long-standing dictatorship gets overthrown in 1974. One of the new democratic government's first actions is to get rid of their colonies. Now, who's going to run Angola? Me, says everyone in Angola with some level of authority, and all their neighboring countries too. A multi-sided civil war begins, ending up lasting nearly 30 years. Once again, the hand of the Kremlin is invoked to mask what really are racial and tribal politics. South Africa has a vested interest in maintaining minority white power at the head of these buffer states between them and the rest of the Black continent. In South Africa, the government of Pretoria requests US intervention. The apartheid regime that ruled South Africa had been formally labeled by the United Nations as a crime against humanity in 1966. In July 1970, the UN adopted a convention that would lead to a global embargo on arms trade with South Africa, with the US and most European powers abstaining from the vote. But that would only come into force in 1977. Meanwhile, Nixon and Kissinger's sympathetic attitude to the white minority, a doctrine known as the tar baby option, gave way to President Gerald Ford, making it illegal for American citizens to trade arms with the government of Pretoria. Yet, under the fog of war, deals would continue to be made. That's exactly what Michael Hand went to Africa to do. During his 1975 turkey farming trip, Hand keeps in frequent contact with Nugan. A note in Nugan's handwriting, found in a folder marked South Africa, reads like a shopping list. Military weapons, Rhodesia. Pay in gold. Recoilless rifles, mortars, 60-80 ml, M79 grenade launches, likely meaning launchers, quad 50 caliber machine guns. Another note outlines how weapons would be bought in the US, chartered via Singapore, and delivered in South Africa. Australian investigators find import permits to that effect. A middle-aged Dutchman named Wilhelmus Hans, hired by Nugan Hand 6 months before Hand left for Africa, reports that Michael Hand would send him long lists of weapons and small aircraft. I wrote to every gun manufacturer in the world asking for brochures and price lists, Wilhelmus would tell authorities. The Dutchman goes to Angola and Rhodesia, which is already a massive red flag, considering both countries at the time hardly ever delivered visas of any kind. Once there, he assists in setting up a company destined to receive weapons in Pretoria. He helps channel the proceeds of the arms sales through shell companies, and he works on establishing a helicopter squadron in Rhodesia. While the US government had no desire to get entangled in wars in Africa, the CIA was sympathetic to anti-communist concerns. William Colby sent 83 CIA agents to southern Africa. John Stockwell, who ran the CIA's Angola operations, recalls that the total of what the CIA brought into Angola came to about 1,500 tons of weapons, 30,000 pieces of rifles, small rockets, and mortars. This equipment, together with the military expertise of Michael Hand and his 82 colleagues, went to 2 of the 3 factions opposing the weak, officially communist Angolan government. The operation was so secret that the White House wasn't in on it. Alas, in both Angola and Rhodesia, CIA interventions fail. They fail to remain covert, instead seeing their aborted coups plastered on headlines worldwide, and they fail to install their candidates in power. In Angola, their shoddy work even provokes exactly what they allegedly wanted to counteract, and was, until then, virtually non-existent: Soviet intervention. A US representative learns of the operations and discusses them with President Ford. In January of 1976, Ford, fearing public backlash, has to shut the whole thing down. William Colby is fired from his post as director of the CIA. Michael Hand returns to Sydney in March 1976. He takes up his functions at the bank like he had never left. In his absence, his partner has set up an innovative system to move funds between Australia and their Hong Kong office. You deposit $100,000 at the bank in Sydney, and it magically appears on an account in your name at the Hong Kong branch. It was never transferred. It was just pulled from the Hong Kong bank's reserves. Neither Australian nor Hong Kong authorities regulating taxes and currency exchange need to know about it. Simple, but brilliant. However, while Hand was away, Nugan made sure the bank maintained a front of being a bank. First, they specialized in trading gold and silver. They weren't very good at it. Then they touted their expertise in arbitrage on the money market, meaning they pay customers an interest rate on their money, then invest said money in corporate debt notes at a slightly higher interest rate. However, records indicate that, as a rule, Nugan Hand invested the monies in question at a substantially lower interest rate. That's not how you make money, that's how you burn money. The Hong Kong Liquidator calculated that between 1976 and 1980, Nugan Hand lost $7.9 million in trading securities. To put it bluntly, the bank side of the Nugan Hand Bank was an extremely obvious front for their other operations. They're much savvier at assisting Australian citizens in tax evasion. Take Mr. Green, a successful peach grower and canner in Griffith, who'd rather not pay income taxes. Nugan Hand creates a corporation on Mr. Green's behalf. Then one of Nugan Hand's local branches, engages into joint venture operations with a new corporation. The deposits from Mr. Green appear not as deposits, but as profits from the joint venture, therefore tax deductible. After which the deposits are returned to Mr. Green, not as taxable income, but as a tax-free loan from the Nugan Hand branch. In the process, Nugan Hand takes a 22% commission on the deposits, and a small fee on top of that for tax advice. That works well for customers in the agricultural trade. Now, if you are, say, a pharmacist, Nugan Hand offers another option. Somewhere in Asia, they set up a phony import firm, registered in your name. Pharmaceutical goods from Europe and the US land not directly at your Australian pharmacy, but rather in your Asian office. Then the phony import firm jacks up the price, double or triple the true cost, before selling it to you, the pharmacist, who owns the import firm in the first place. So you can, on the one hand, write off substantial tax deductions on sums that you actually still own, and on the other hand, move the sums in question to offshore accounts. Not a lot of this is legal. You can't move money into or from Australia the way you can to or from the US. Australia, like many other countries, has developed an array of regulatory barriers aimed at keeping Australian money in Australia. You can't pay staff at your international branches without special permission from the Reserve Bank. You can't invest abroad unless you show proof that you paid taxes on your capital. And you can't bring money into Australia unless you tell the taxman what it's for. The same thing goes for residents of Southeast Asian countries. They can't invest in Australia without massive amounts of paperwork and high taxes. So, Nugan Hand improves on their original scheme, the transfer without transfer switcheroo. They ask a Nugan Hand Bank emissary to open a foreign exchange account in a legit Australian bank. He registers the account with the proper authorities. Now, he's legally allowed to import Australian cash from Asia. He goes to Hong Kong, collects the cash in a suitcase, returns to Australia, but on the way to the bank, the Nugan Hand emissary stops for coffee. There, he meets with Australian nationals who wish to illegally export money. He adds their cash to his suitcase and deposits the lot into his legal international account. Now the money is ready to be exported, with the blessings of the Reserve Bank. Month after month, the bank fine-tunes more sophisticated schemes. Most people have watched a few episodes of Breaking Bad. Most people know how to launder money between the soapy spinning brushes of a New Mexico car wash. But when you're an Australian bank, deprived of the benefits of free capital circulation enjoyed in the US, things require a little more creativity. Say Mr. Blue, an international businessman, wants to buy his dream house in Sydney for $200,000, but Mr. Blue's Australian bank will only finance half of it. Now, Mr. Blue has money in a Hong Kong bank account, where taxes are low, but he can't use it to buy the house. He can't import capital into Australia without the Reserve Bank getting interested. That's where Nugan Hand comes in. Nugan Hand has another customer, Mr. Pink. Mr. Pink is an honest man with life savings to invest. Mr. Pink, through Nugan Hand, buys Mr. Blue's dream house for the sticker price, $200,000. Then Mr. Pink, still via Nugan Hand, sells the house to Mr. Blue for just $100,000. That's a loss for Mr. Pink, a loss he reports on his tax bill for deductions. Obviously, he can't deduct all of it, but that's okay, because his supposedly lost $100,000 miraculously reappears on a Nugan Hand Hong Kong account in Mr. Pink's name, where it's going to accrue more interest for less taxes than in Australia. Where does that $100,000 come from? From Mr. Blue's Hong Kong account. Nugan Hand assures both parties that what they're doing is perfectly legal. It is emphatically not. They are perpetrating currency exchange fraud, investor fraud, and tax fraud at the very least. But while Mr. Blue is a savvy international businessman who takes his chances, Mr. Pink is a retired ophthalmologist who trusts Frank Nugan's law credentials, such as they are. Still, not everybody is as trusting as Mr. Pink or as comfortable with law evasion as Mr. Blue. So Nugan Hand needs guarantees that they can show customers. They acquire legitimacy by offering high interest rates for short periods of time to bigger banks, reputable international banks. Chase Manhattan once deposited as much as $1 million into their Nugan Hand account. Why on earth would they do that? You see, in Hong Kong, the Kwok family operated a bank called Wing Hong, as well as a chain of department stores and other businesses. Today, the Kwoks are the richest family in Hong Kong. The Wing Hong Bank put up their own money to guarantee depositors who wanted to trade with Nugan Hand, Hong Kong private depositors, as well as international corporate ones such as Chase Manhattan and other US banks. I hope you noticed the subtlety back there. Outside of Hong Kong, Wing Hong was only good for the corporate accounts. That's not something private Australian citizens were made aware of. In late 1976, the system is flourishing. Time to develop the international branches. Michael Hand moves to Hong Kong to supervise the expansion of the bank. His offices are located a few floors below the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Hand and his wife rent a $1 million penthouse. That would be $12 million today. Subsidiaries open in Singapore, Bangkok, Taipei, and Manila. In Hong Kong, the crime underworld is run by the triads, and they, like all of Asia, believe in cash. This was long before China began doing all payments through QR codes. Doug Sapper is a friend of Michael Hand's from their Vietnam days and one of the last 3 Americans to leave Phnom Penh before it fell to the Khmer Rouge. Sapper occasionally does odd and very discreet jobs for the Hong Kong branch. He remembers a lumber merchant, possibly a triad member, dropping $10 million in cash on a table at the bank and saying he'd come back for it in 2 weeks. Michael Hand offered the man a receipt. "I don't need a receipt," said the man. "If you're gonna screw me, you're gonna screw me. Receipt or no receipt." That would certainly make some dealings easier. It also makes confidentiality a priority. The bank adopts a code system. There are codes for employees. Nugan is 536, Hand 537. Also codes for currencies. US dollars are latex. Australian dollars are hide. Singapore dollars, glassware. The result is, of course, that you could never balance the books. One of the bank's Australian lawyers remembers he could never tell what was real and what wasn't, nor where the $1 million in cash routinely kept in the safe came from. But it makes the bank attractive for a certain kind of customer. Nugan Hand hires George Shah, a Lebanese immigrant who had been running a coin dealership. His commodity specialty is silver. They hire Andrew Lowe, who ran an illegal gambling den in Sydney's Chinatown. His commodity specialty is pure heroin. Shaw and Lowe bring in depositors from the Lebanese and Chinese crime underworlds in Sydney. A large number of them are involved in the dope trade. They appreciate a bank that can transfer their money across international borders without attracting attention. Among the depositors, there would also be honest, God-fearing families. The Mr. Pinks enticed by the sales force to entrust the bank with their life savings. But not at first. At first, the whole purpose, George Shaw would later tell the Stuart Royal Commission, was to attract people with black money and to assure them that their anonymity would be preserved. George Shaw handled around 25 accounts from drug traffickers, including syndicate members from the Lebanese community. 1 year goes by. More presentable clients line up. They include the host of a popular radio show, the owner of a major Aussie Rules football team and several of its players, the senior manager of the reputable Australian ANZ Bank, and an assistant VP of Irving Trust, the New York organization controlling the Hong Kong Wing Hang Bank. Soon, Nugan Hand persuades city councils in the state of New South Wales to deposit with them the tax money that they're holding. This represents accounts sometimes as large as $5 million each. It also represents opportunities to strengthen ties with elected politicians. The same goes for their international branches. The Manila office harbors funds from the Marcos family, who is ruling and looting the Philippines at the time. President Marcos' sister Elizabeth, a provincial governor, deposits $3.5 million at Nugan Hand. If you're thinking this sort of proximity to power can't be bought by a couple of Australian lawyers, you're right. The representative of Nugan Hand in the Philippines is 3-star General Leroy J. Menor. A much-decorated U.S. Air Force pilot, Menor became assistant to the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon for, quote, counterinsurgency and special activities. He was promoted all the way up to Chief of Staff for the entire U.S. Pacific Command, meaning he managed and coordinated Air Force, Navy, Army, and Marine Corps operations from California to East Africa and from the Arctic to the Antarctic. General Menor's bio packs more holes than a prairie dog town and more rumors than a Fleetwood Mac album, and he runs the subsidiary of an Australian bank in the Philippines. He does, despite the fact that the government of the Philippines never chartered Nugan Hand as a bank, making it illegal for the bank to take deposits. Like many of the other Asian subsidiaries, they can only broker international trade deals, but the bank has close ties to the highest powers. Extremely close, in fact. Say, 30 yards or so. Elizabeth Marcos' husband, Ludwig Roca, the president's brother-in-law, shares his office suite with Nugan Hand in Manila. While General Menor deals with the highest powers in the Philippines, other branches deal with society's lowest underbelly. Take the Chiang Mai subsidiary. At the time, Chiang Mai in Thailand is the door to the Golden Triangle and the world's narcotic supermarket. You could find an opium den faster than you can find a cup of coffee. Drugs from all over Southeast Asia are funneled through the town. Transferring drug money coming from the poppy fields of Myanmar is the raison d'etre of that particular branch. After the collapse of Nugan Hand, Neil Evans, chief of the Chiang Mai office, gave an interview to 60 Minutes Australia.
Most of the money that went through Nugan Hand here in Chiang Mai was drug money, all of it. All of it, every cent. Every cent.
He evaluated the drug money that went through his bank at $2.6 million US dollars, roughly $33 million today, in 3 years. Surely the Chiang Mai office made sure to be as invisible as possible to the prying eyes of authorities, right? John Dowd, an Australian member of parliament involved in drug crime busting, later New South Wales Attorney General and a Supreme Court Justice, visited the Chiang Mai office. He found, quote,
"There was just a wall between Nugan Hand and the US Drug Enforcement Agency."
In mid-1977, directors of the Bangkok and Chiang Mai subsidiaries are called to Hong Kong for a meeting. Neil Evans, our man in Chiang Mai, recalls what Michael Hand told them. He had been successful in arranging a contract with the CIA, whereby the bank was to become its paymaster. Money would be deposited in the Nugan Hand Bank by the CIA through various channels. The Nugan Hand Bank would be the repository coming in from various CIA enterprises, namely drugs in Thailand, marijuana in particular, and the Nugan Hand Bank would be responsible for rerouting that money to an account in America with a New York bank. Michael Hand insists that this information must be kept away from Frank Nugan. Clearly, Hand doesn't trust his partner to keep his mouth shut. It's not even clear that Nugan knew exactly what the Chiang Mai office was doing. You see, Frank Nugan had started drinking. And like many things with Nugan, his drinking knew no limits. He probably started when his wife left Australia with the kids. By mid-1977, Nugan is up to 1.5 bottles of scotch a day. To try and win his wife back, he adds yet more extravagant luxuries to his multi-million-dollar waterfront mansion. But his wife stays in the US. John Owen, the bank's representative in Bangkok, remembers a meeting with Nugan in May of 1978. The meeting started at 9:30 a.m. It ended half an hour and 3 whiskey sodas later. The bank staff report that while Nugan was lucid in the morning, by mid-afternoon he was belligerent and slurred his words. End of business day would find him either stumbling into a city hotel, incapable of driving home, or simply collapsed under his desk. Not the kind of guy you want to let in on classified intel. Neil Evans, who, let me remind you, deals with hardcore heroin purveyors on a daily basis, is more than a little rattled by the news of the CIA deal. Quote, terrified. In a word, terrified. As I was going down in the lift, I was thinking to myself, how the hell am I going to get out of this gracefully? The CIA are the heaviest people on earth. Life was ultra cheap to them. Evans finds a doctor who certifies that he's sick with hepatitis and needs to return to Australia for treatment. He never came back to Nugan Hand. Does it feel completely outlandish to you that a minor bank that had never employed an actual banker would assist in financing CIA covert military operations by laundering their drug money? If so, here's a reality check. Back in late 1976, Nugan Hand got rid of their lightweight accountant, one Mr. Brinkat, to have their books certified by the Bahamas branch of the respectable accounting firm Price Waterhouse. Why the Bahamas branch? Because it also covers the Cayman Islands, the world's sunniest tax shelter. Exactly at that time, late 1976, Price Waterhouse was also certifying the accounts of 2 other banks. Both were based in the Bahamas, both had ties to the CIA, they were pretty much the same company. One had shares in the other, one deposited substantial funds in the other, they shared offices and directors, so let's call them the Twin Bank. A central figure in the Twin Bank was Paul Helliwell. Helliwell had been chief of OSS, which would become the CIA during World War II. Later, he traded guns for drugs in Thailand for the CIA. After which, he directed the financial operations behind the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. A former federal officer familiar with the Twin Bank told the Wall Street Journal on April 16, 1980, that Helliwell's bank was, quote, one of the CIA's finance channels for operations against Cuba. Like Nugan Hand, who assisted people willing to cheat on their Australian taxes, Helliwell's bank allegedly helped US citizens defraud Uncle Sam. The difference is that the American IRS is infinitely larger, nosier, and more powerful than its Australian counterpart. And the CIA, once again, like Fleetwood Mac, goes their own way. Don't go thinking they wouldn't get into trouble with the IRS just because that's another US government agency. If anything, I think this suggests that if the CIA had a slightly tighter leash, they'd be less accountable. If someone high up in the government knew about what the CIA was getting up to, they could tell the IRS to lay off it. But we're talking about shenanigans that even the White House probably didn't know about. We're talking about the CIA acting as an almost totally independent criminal organization, and like any other criminal organization, it was liable to be investigated for tax evasion by the very same government it's ostensibly part of. In 1973, the IRS, unaware of the Twin Bank's CIA connection, launched an investigation into Helliwell's businesses. In late 1976, the Twin Bank collapsed after depositors discovered that none of the company's supposed $25 million in assets, certified by Price Waterhouse, existed in real life. It may well be that Nugan Hand got a friendly push from the CIA in order to replace the failing Caribbean front banks. The agency may even have suggested that the bank use the Bahamas accounting firm for the books, lending Nugan Hand an air of respectability. Nugan Hand hired Pricewaterhouse precisely as the twin bank situation developed. At the very least, we can say for sure that there was ample precedent in Nugan Hand's banking with the CIA, and there was a void to fill. Between the fall of the twin bank and Hand's announcement of the CIA deal, there was less than 6 months. Let's take a minute, though, to dwell on the apparently most boring piece of news in this latest development, the firing of the old accountant and the hiring of a reputable international firm to certify the books. Because, like Al Capone and tax fraud, this administrative decision would come back to bite Nugan Hand at the worst possible time. Another unexpected source of worry for the bank comes from the business founded by Frank Nugan's parents and run by their son Ken, the Nugan Fruit Group. The two world wars had brought to Griffith a huge contingent of Italian immigrants. Most were running above-board operations, later to become some of the highest regarded wineries and rice fields on the little continent. But other newcomers, from Calabria, a region of astonishing beauty at the toe of the Italian boot, plagued by the particularly violent syndicate 'Ndrangheta, were quick to establish a criminal network in Griffith. They named it L'Onorata Società, the Honored Society. 'Ndrangheta looks like the mafia, walks like the mafia, quacks like the mafia, but they sometimes consider the mafia their worst enemies. The mafia is Sicilian, 'Ndrangheta is Calabrian. They took control of the Griffith weed farming world and started shipping their produce all over Europe and North America. In the mid-1970s, the Griffith branch president of the Labour Party, a furniture dealer named Donald McKay, rises to speak up against the drug traffic in the Griffith area. He calls in the arrest of several weed growers of Italian descent. His actions are met with such enthusiastic public response that he decides to run for office on the issue. On July 15, 1977, Donald McKay disappears from a hotel parking lot. Detectives recover 3 spent .22 caliber cartridges, blood, clumps of hair, drag marks, plenty of signs that McKay has left this earth on an early express train. Investigating McKay's demise, authorities look into the Nugan Fruit Group. They find checks for thousands of dollars made out to 2 members of the Trimboli and Sergi families, the 2 main Calabrian crime families running the marijuana trade. 3 months later, the Nugan family only owns 50% of the Nugan Fruit Group. Between them and their minority shareholders, the tension mounts to the point that Frank Nugan, great at pouring gasoline on fires, has to resign from his post of director of the company. Then the group's auditors suspect that Ken Nugan is paying Woolworths buyers under the table in order to get orders from the major British supermarket chain. That's fraud. To put the shareholders' quarrel to rest, Ken asks his brother Frank for advice. On October 27, 1977, the group calls for an extraordinary board meeting, something that would usually attract no more than 30 shareholders. But this time, there are 250 people lining the halls, 194 of whom are newly registered and only possess a handful of shares. They vote as one to expel the nosy auditors. And that's more fraud. The Donald McKay murder, the noise it makes in the media, the checks made out to the mob, and the various fraud accusations directed at the Nugan Fruit Group are attracting a lot of flack to the bank's doorstep. Nugan Hand takes spring cleaning measures. Not the ones you'd expect from an honest-to-goodness bank, though. A few directors who asked for answers about the checks are fired, and the bank's auditors are fired too, after a pair of former crime squad detectives with a horrendous reputation pay them a little visit in their homes at night. Too little, too late. By week's end, 40% of depositors' funds are withdrawn from the Sydney branch, and now the Australian Narcotics Bureau is investigating Nugan Hand. They execute a search warrant at the lodgings of Andrew Lowe. That's the heroin trafficker briefly hired by the bank in 1975 for his connection with Sydney's Chinese underworld. Caught with a pound of heroin and thousands of dollars under his mattress, Lowe becomes a police informant. He details how he brought in deposits from drug trafficking members of the Pak Yok Lin, a Chinese crime syndicate. And he moans that he's small potatoes compared to his former employers at the bank. According to Dennis Kelly of the Narcotics Bureau, Lowe said, "The names are Frank Nugan and Michael Hand. They are bigger than anything you've ever seen here in the heroin game, and they're said to be part of an American security organization." On February 14, 1978, upon learning of the Narcotics Bureau investigation, Frank Nugan flies to Canberra to meet the men in charge. "Some of our clients are very powerful people," he tells them. "You're welcome to come to Sydney and look at our books." 5 weeks later, the Bureau drops the investigation. Subsequently, Richard Spencer, A senior narcotics investigator is informed that an account at Nugan Hand is opened in his name and credited with $10,000. One fire seems out, the other starts up again. In late May 1978, both Frank and Ken Nugan are arrested for fraud in the Nugan Fruit Group case. Now Michael Hand worries that his business partner is hurting the business. International deals are evaporating. Potential partnerships are halted. Lloyd's Bank in Manila closes their account. Hand warns Nugan that the fraud case has serious repercussions. Nugan assures him that the case will never get to court. Then he proceeds to make sure of it. First, he activates his powerful political contacts. Senior Labour Party figures pressure the Attorney General of New South Wales, Frank Walker, to desist from the Griffith investigations. These senior politicians are the same who encouraged local councils like Marrickville, Leichhardt, and South Sydney to put money into the bank. But following his arrest and the switch to the new Prime Minister, Frank Nugan changes his allegiance to the ruling Liberal Party, which has deposited millions of dollars in the bank, also through municipal councils. Step 2 of Nugan's plan to destroy Attorney General Walker takes place in Switzerland. Nugan sets up a bank account at the Union Bank of Switzerland under the moniker of the Phantom. You may know that the eponymous comic strip character's real name is Walker. Nugan deposits regular monies into this account. Anyone finding out would think the AG is corrupt. But that doesn't work, so here comes step 3. Nugan offers $50,000 to anyone willing to take out the Attorney General. You heard that right, it's a contract of the definitive kind. In Hong Kong, Bernie Houghton tries to convince Doug Sapper, Michael Hand's Vietnam friend who does odd jobs for the bank, to answer the ad. Sapper declines. Hand does not appreciate the refusal. He sets up Sapper to go deliver 500 watches to a friend of his in Nepal. What do you know? Sapper gets caught. He spends 2 years in prison in Kathmandu, a sentence he only survives thanks to his military training. Mid-1978, Hand recruits General Earl Koch to run the Washington, D.C. branch. Now the bank is all set up to make a play for the largest money-moving operation of the century. Autumn 1978. In Tehran, the Shah of Iran declares martial law, but he knows the rebellion is growing by the day. The US, who put him in power in 1953 via a CIA-orchestrated coup, isn't ready to back him up with military support. He prepares to flee the country, taking with him 60 billion, with a B, US dollars. 720 billion today, give or take. Moving such incredibly huge amounts discreetly is hard. Swiss banks turn down the Shah's requests. Nugan Hand, however, sees the opportunity. General Ed Black, heading the Hawaii office, has a direct line to the Shah's military command. Through their subsidiary in Germany, the bank begins operations to transfer $1.5 billion of the Shah's dollars to its Cayman Islands branch. That would produce a commission for the bank of $7.5 million. When someone hands me $7.5 million, I tend to say thanks. Not Nugan Hand. Displeased with the agreed commission, they keep hundreds of millions of the Shah's money for themselves. 2 things of note here. 1, it's impossible to find exactly how much money Nugan Hand skimmed from the Shah's booty. Come to think of it, it's impossible to figure out how much the Shah himself did smuggle out of the country. 60 billion is the figure quoted by post-revolutionary Iranian officials. Paperwork found at Nugan Hand suggests it was closer to 100 billion. And 2, whatever possessed the Shah to entrust that much money to a second-rate Australian operation? It doesn't make any sense unless, of course, faithful allies gave him the assurance that Nugan Hand could be trusted. Wonder who that could have been. During the same time, gun running is back on the agenda. Bernie Houghton is in Saudi Arabia. He now heads the bank's activities in the Middle East. Translation, he defrauds the local expats, civilians and military alike, of savings they'd rather not pay taxes on. Witnesses describe him touring Saudi Arabia with a big garbage bag full of cash slung over his shoulder like some kind of reverse Santa. Houghton is also in the weapons business. He entertains links with Edwin P. Wilson. Wilson may be the least savory character in this story, and that's saying something. He is a former senior CIA operative with very little consideration for legalities, national or international. At the time, Wilson is wanted by the FBI. He would later spend 22 years in prison for supplying tons of plastic explosives to Gaddafi's Libya. Neil Evans, the former Chiang Mai bank director, alleged that Nugan Hand served as a conduit for a $200 million arms shipment from Wilson to Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, General Ed Black, the bank's Hawaiian representative, engages in talks to sell fragmentation bombs in a helicopter squadron to South Africa. International embargo be damned. Admiral Yates, the bank's president, pitches NATO munitions and patrol boats to the Indonesian Navy. As for Michael Hand, he's involved in a deal to sell Swedish anti-aircraft guns and gunboats to the Thai military. Why isn't the Bangkok office taking care of that? Because the Bangkok office is trying to raise arms for the Shan states, remnants of the Kuomintang army in the Golden Triangle, deeply involved in the heroin trade. Nugan Hand, more bang for your buck. If you can still keep track of any of this, and I don't fault you for not, you may have noticed that Frank Nugan is nowhere to be seen. From the moment he's indicted in the Nugan fruit scandal in October 1978, Frank Nugan tries to fathom himself a clean bill of health. He protests in writing against a memo sent by General Black detailing his current arms deals. Nugan claims the bank has nothing to do with the, quote, nonsense activities like those. By February 1979, the friendship between Hand and Nugan turns to mutual mistrust. Hand allegedly tells Houghton he's looking for a way to ease Nugan out of the bank. In April 1979, bank staffers notice a change in Frank Nugan. He's stopped drinking. Helped by Michael Hand, he's drowned his sorrows another way: religion. Nugan goes to church every day, sometimes twice a day. Everywhere he goes, he carries a Bible. Inside the cover, he writes, "God is our partner, GNHB." I do wonder if he ever got the chance to ask the big man if he approved of his name being associated with the Nugan Hand Bank. The cast of characters who transfer drug money through Nugan Hand reads like bad mafia movie credits. We have men with at least one alias. A dude working for American mob hitman Jimmy the Weasel, another referred to only as W. Yet these fine folks are comparatively small potatoes. The bigger spud is Mr. Asia, which is not a man, it's a syndicate. One of the largest heroin trafficking networks in the world at the time. Cue the entrance to center stage of a minor character. Brian Alexander is a law clerk for Frank Nugan's lawyer. He was instrumental in the payoff to narcotics agent Richard Spencer. At the same time, he had developed a banking relationship with Mr. Asia representatives. Brian Alexander is paid a monthly retainer to organize police protection for the syndicate. Things get hairy when Mr. Asia's number 2, Terry Clark, murders Christopher Johnstone, the gang's number 1, and dumps some of his body parts in an English quarry. A long and convoluted inquest discovers the involvement in the syndicate of various Australian citizens, including senior narcotics officers and Brian Alexander. Then, witnesses start disappearing, as they do, to wit the tribulations of one particular duffel bag containing 260 grand. That money transited through Nugan Hand. That much has been proven. It's believed to have paid the hitman who, on orders from inside Mr. Asia, got rid of 2 Queensland Syndicate members singing like so many canaries at the police station. Their bodies are found in shallow graves in May 1979. In June, a combined police task force starts investigating their allegations. Their best estimate is that Mr. Asia shepherded $3 million through Nugan Hand to accounts abroad. The bank's commission may have been as high as 50%. Within days of the duffel bag proceedings arriving in Singapore, Brian Alexander deposits $10,000 on the account of Richard Spencer. Yes, you've heard that before. Spencer is the senior narcotics bureau officer who received $10,000 already for torpedoing the investigation into Nugan fruit. This is his second payment. Spencer is at the time heading an investigation into the Mr. Asia syndicate. $10,000 may not seem like a lot, considering everything else, but it's pretty much what an investigator like Spencer would have made in a year. Apparently not everyone in the Australian Narcotics Bureau is either corrupt or sleeping at the wheel. 2 weeks after that money transfer, October 3rd, 1979, 2 narcotics agents pay a visit to Frank Nugan. They seem to have been eloquent enough. Nugan calls for a meeting of the bank's legal staff. He is not entirely making sense, saying that, quote, "I may be hallucinating, but I operate with a fragmentation theory of thinking." Yet his orders are clear. The bank has been involved in illegal operations. They need to disengage themselves from anything untoward. Now. Michael Hand listens to the tape of Nugan's speech. These guys taped everything. The tape is incriminating for the bank, as Nugan admits to a variety of wrongdoings. And it makes Nugan a clear and present danger for the meeting Hand has planned for the coming days. 48 hours later, the bank's international directors fly into Sydney. They meet at the Gazebo Hotel on King's Cross. The main item on the agenda: meet the bank's new president. This is October 1979, and a small revolution just happened inside the Nugan Hand Bank. Donald Beasley has been hired, a former president of the Great American Bank in Miami. He's the first real banker employed by the organization. He replaces Admiral Yates at the post of president of the Nugan Hand Holding Company. He takes charge of daily operations in a corporation that now numbers 40 subsidiaries around the globe. Nugan and Hand become co-chairmen. More high-ranking military personnel and former CIA senior staff are hired. Among them, William Colby, former director of the CIA, is hired as legal counsel. A bank employee tapes the speeches delivered on that occasion. International representatives are growing nervous. The Singapore administrator requests that the bank go easy on the cash payments and remarks that they, quote, literally function like a bank, which he calls risky to do in Singapore, quote, since we don't have banking status. The CIA veteran running the Taiwan branch remarks that it is illegal to take money from Taiwan, something they are, of course, doing. The Malaysian representative notes how uncomfortable it is to solicit deposits when they're not a registered bank. One of the Manila execs advocates for a better in-house courier service, noting that in the Philippines, quote, the telephone is monitored, the telex is monitored, 90% of the mail is opened when it goes overseas. Breaking the law on such a grand scale appears to be a harrowing business. Between Nugan and Hand, the tension is palpable. Nugan is irrational. His speech to attendees alternates between self-aggrandizement and incoherence. He's a liability. Hand orders a bank associate to accompany Nugan on all his business trips abroad. The next day, while meetings go on, Nugan and Hand have a private conversation. The exchange of insults devolves, according to a staffer present, into an exchange of blows. Furniture gets smashed. Nugan announces he's stepping down as chief legal advisor. Every executive position at the bank is now held by Americans. Bernie Houghton is the first to act on the mounting stench emanating from this whole mess. He proceeds to disengage from all Middle East operations. And, bit by stinking bit, it gets worse. Nugan learns that his brother and himself will have to appear in court for the Nugan fruit business. In November 1979, he learns that Brian Alexander has been arrested by the Mr. Asia investigators, along with Richard Spencer, the corrupt Narcotics Bureau officer. This puts Frank Nugan between a rock, the police investigations, and a hard place, the Mr. Asia members who'd rather not disclose their financial arrangements. In the first week of January 1980, an auditor at the bank informs Nugan that unless he can locate 5 million Australian dollars to pay internal bills, the auditor will be forced to, quote, qualify the accounts. In plain English, he would expose Nugan Hand as bankrupt. Nugan starts drinking again. And now, Price Waterhouse, the company certifying the books in the Bahamas, are asking more questions than usual. At the close of business years 1977 and 78, they had certified the books without a twitch. In the wake of the Twin Bank scandal, though, the accounting firm overhauls its procedures, and a new office chief is named. Admiral Yates, who had personally signed the 1977 and 78 auditor reports, goes into negotiation mode. But in January 1980, Frank Nugan says he'll handle the matter personally. Before he leaves for the Bahamas, Nugan goes to the US, where he gives his life insurance policy to his wife. When he returns to the office, Bernie Houghton pays him a visit. That's unusual. Houghton has consistently expressed his dislike of Nugan. He doesn't drop by to say hello. He delivers a message. It's not a stretch to imagine that the message went something like, Frank, you're in a lot of trouble. Shortly afterward, Nugan purchases an assault rifle and an axe. I'm sorry, a what now? I mean, you want a gun for defense, that's one thing. And if that was all Nugan had bought, the gun might have been construed as his self-issued passport to eternity. But an axe? Since when do people, even those with a fragmentation theory of thinking, use axes to terminate themselves? What on earth did Nugan intend to do with that? The pressure is escalating. Authorities in Singapore give the bank a deadline to have their accounts certified. Hong Kong seems to be waking up to the problem too. Most urgent are the questions asked by Price Waterhouse, which Nugan had said he would handle. But instead of treating the matter seriously, Nugan tries to pull a fast one. He arrives in the Bahamas sounding like a kid who didn't do his homework. You'll never guess what happens, he tells Price Waterhouse. He claims he put together a file containing all the answers the accountants needed, and he forgot the file back in Sydney. He makes a big show of asking his secretary over the phone to send the file. He has dinner with the auditors, then he leaves. 2 weeks later, he would be dead. Very few people who knew Nugan believed that he had chosen to depart this mortal and highly profitable coil on his own terms, and that's putting it mildly. The inquest reveals even more questionable behavior from the policemen who discovered Nugan's body. They elected not to take photographs of the scene. They did not conserve the live bullets inside the rifle for fingerprints. They determined the body's position was not suspicious when, as one lawyer remarked, Nugan would have had to be a contortionist to receive the head wound in that position. Of course it doesn't sit right, but before jumping to conclusions of police manipulation, and while I mean no offense to our viewers down under, let's just remember that the Australian authorities of the time had a track record of, how can I put this, favoring the innocent option. The murder cases involving Baven Spencer von Einem before the Nugan Hand scandal and backpacker killer Ivan Milat a decade afterwards are just two examples among many of criminal investigations refusing to connect the dots until they blew up in their collective face. Remember my previous episode about Aussie criminal conspiracies? The Democracy Manifest story? This guy had been arrested, tried, and jailed on dozens of charges over the course of his life. Again and again, he escaped from jail, fled to a neighboring Australian state, and seemed to be totally fine until he was arrested for a different crime. Conspiracy is not necessarily the better answer, where incompetence and denial are involved. After Nugan's death, the bank's priority is not to pay the panicked depositors. Oh no. Panic seems to have landed squarely on the other side of the cashier's booth. Understandable when you own millions of dollars belonging to powerful drug dealers. Those esteemed customers seem to have been reimbursed first. Then come a few depositors who have understood what they're dealing with. A lawyer representing a dentist makes it clear that, quote, he has a pistol in the glove box of his car that he's not afraid to use. Bank executives receive more death threats at their homes. They pay. Town councils, football clubs, and President Marcos' sister all get their money back. Bernie Houghton's clients in Florida are paid. Those in Saudi Arabia are not. Simultaneously, more death threats are handed down by none other than Michael Hand to his own staff. He orders them to destroy their records and shut their mouths, or else their wives will end up, quote, cut up in small pieces and returned to them in brown paper parcels. Then comes the destroying of records, and yet, throughout the chaos, Houghton and Hand assure depositors that it's business as usual. They keep bringing in new clients, if you can believe that. Since Nugan's death made very little noise in the Middle East, Bernie Houghton is back in Saudi Arabia, collecting more garbage bags of cash from American military officers, oilmen, and construction workers. So is General Menor. Up in Manila, they offer fantastical interest rates and they misappropriate the deposits. They transfer funds from their branches abroad into Sydney, at least $2 million from Hong Kong alone. In April, Michael Hand testifies at the first inquest. At the time, the authorities have no idea of his CIA background. Hand presents very well. He blames Nugan for everything and anything, and he claims that Nugan was murdered. That may have been what he really believed. It may also have been a generous gesture to allow Nugan's widow to benefit from the $1 million life insurance policy, or a less generous gesture to allow him to cash in on the policy in the same amount he himself took on Nugan. But after hearing all witnesses, the coroner concludes that Nugan's fatal wound really was self-inflicted. The hypothesis that he may have been, let's say, persuaded to pull the trigger by person or persons unknown is not considered. Upon learning that the bank is insolvent, the Hong Kong police impound the books of the local Nugan Hand branch. That turns out to have been a huge break in the case for Australian investigators. The books reveal the names of big-time drug dealers. Meanwhile, Bernie Houghton is leaving Saudi Arabia in a hurry on board a military plane. Depositors attack the Riyadh Nugan Hand office with stones. Australian authorities proceed to the Singapore offices, where they find Michael Hand with his leg in a cast. The man had gone off skiing over the weekend and broke his leg. Seriously? Skiing? At a time like this? Moving on. Hand says the requested documents are locked in a rosewood cabinet and he doesn't have the keys. When the investigators insist, Michael Hand gets angry, swings his leg around and smashes the rosewood cabinet with his plaster cast. Bernie Houghton is the first to vanish. In Sydney, he meets up with a silver-haired American by the name of Thomas Clines, who just flew in. Clines is the former CIA liaison officer at the Pentagon. He is now heading an international gun-running business. Of course he is. 2 days later, in May 1980, Clines exfiltrates Bernie Houghton to the Philippines. In June, it's Michael Hand's turn to meet a CIA operative in Sydney. The agent is Oswald Spencer. Real name, Spencer Oswald. For real. A Special Forces and CIA alum, he changed his name in the wake of JFK's assassination by another Oswald. He spends 3 weeks in Sydney, 3 weeks during which Michael Hand turns into Alan Winter. He sports a fake beard and a fake mustache. This, in CIA parlance, is called tradecraft, the ability to fly in at a moment's notice and execute a tricky operation, change someone's appearance, procure a fake passport, find the safest route out. Michael Hand departs through Fiji to Canada. The tabloid press is having a field day. They publish rumors placing Michael Hand in Brazil, in Atlanta, in Kansas City. Better still, they announce that Nugan is alive and well and living in South America. Later that year, a man identified only as a respectable Australian businessman assures the New South Wales Attorney General that he just saw Frank Nugan in the restroom of a bar in Georgia. The businessman knows Nugan personally. He had dealings with the bank. He says he talked to Nugan, then and there in the bathroom, addressed him by his first name, and the other guy answered. His claim is believable. In February 1981, to settle the matter, Australian authorities exhumed Frank Nugan's corpse in front of the press and television cameras in the pouring rain. Dental records confirm the deceased Nugan's identity. Now that we know where Nugan is, can we track down Michael Hand? Good question. A better question would be, who is we? Because neither the CIA, nor the FBI, nor ASIO, Australia's intelligence agency, seem in a major hurry to do so. The Australian Joint Task Force investigating the bank sends information requests to the CIA through ASIO. They will later learn that ASIO forwarded none of their requests to the CIA. You don't say. In 1982, the Wall Street Journal publishes an article on the bank, calling the debacle a joint CIA-FBI cover-up. The article also alleges links between the bank and international gun trafficker Edwin Wilson, now the subject of a massive FBI manhunt. The White House's own intelligence board, IOB, wants answers. With its back against the wall, the FBI finally launches a serious investigation into Nugan Hand. They interview witnesses, including CIA operatives. Is it all for show? The CIA knows exactly where Michael Hand is. He's hiding in Honduras, along with 150 CIA operatives, lending his military skills to the 5th Puma Battalion. They're training paramilitary forces in order to subvert the Sandinista revolutionaries who came into power in neighboring Nicaragua. They need lawyers, guns, and money. Some of the agents recruit drug traffickers and use drug money to buy weapons. Weapons later used in a coup in Nicaragua. The shit has hit the fan. This would culminate in the Iran-Contra scandal that smeared the Reagan presidency. From that scandal, you may remember the name of Oliver North. Alongside North, other key CIA agents involved were Richard Seckert and Thomas Clines, the same Thomas Clines who exfiltrated Bernie Houghton from Australia. For the record, none of the dozen investigations initiated by Australian authorities came to anything. Just 2 people were ever prosecuted, and only for their involvement in destroying bank records. Said Doug Sapper, Michael Hand's friend who smuggled watches into Nepal, "It's like the Western movies. It's horseshit and gunsmoke." And through it all, we just might have to put aside the suspicious circumstances surrounding the death of Frank Nugan. Suspicious they are, and the final verdict of the Australian inquest, blaming the deceased for his untimely end, isn't entirely convincing, yet I can't help but defer to the 2 main sources for this episode, Wall Street Journal reporter Jonathan Whitney and Australian journalist Peter Butt. Both spent years of their lives investigating Nugan Hand. They certainly don't shy from exposing crimes, corruption, secrets, and conspiracies at the highest level. Nevertheless, both journalists hint that they too came to believe no one but Nugan was responsible for pulling the trigger. Peter Butt obtained the 1965 Griffith High yearbook. It features an essay by Frank Nugan. The 14-year-old imagines his last days as a young fighter pilot in the theater of war. It reads in part, "Yes, you're the boy in the long silver jet. You've got lost. You're all alone now. No one to get you home now, is there? Yes, those are the enemy over there. Your fear is gone. There is only a faint tinkling going through your body. You must crash your plane and kill yourself. Yes, that's your mother getting a telegram to say you were killed in action. Only you know how you died, and the secret will never be told." Peter Butt does not believe in ghosts. In 2015, the Australian journalist is writing the final chapters of his book on Nugan Hand, Merchants of Menace. Refusing to believe that people can just disappear, he decides to give a last go at finding Michael Hand, something the FBI has apparently been unable to do for the past 35 years. It takes him a few months. Peter Butt works on 3 assumptions: that Hand is in the US, that he kept his first name, a common CIA practice to avoid awkward conversations in case an old acquaintance bumps into your new self, and that he also kept his middle name, John, with the less common spelling Jon. The journalist locates a Michael John Fuller, a tactical knives manufacturer in Idaho Falls. Idaho Falls isn't exactly Manhattan, but it's not a nondescript town consisting of a main road, a church, and a gas station either. The biggest city in the state of Idaho, outside the Boise metro area, it's the commercial, cultural, and healthcare hub of eastern Idaho's Mormon-majority region. It saw the only lethal nuclear reactor accident on American soil, at an experimental U.S. Army plant in the prairie nearby. It also hosts a secret Santa who, after anonymously helping residents for a decade to the tune of $1 million a year, donated a $60 million check to the state budget on Christmas 2025. An interesting rabbit hole. By no means a quietly fading dot on the map. So, Peter Butt finds this Michael Fuller in Idaho Falls. He compares a picture of Fuller, now in his 70s, with Hand's. It's a match. The birth dates and, incredibly, the social security numbers are identical. Also, tactical knives manufacturer? Again, we're saying this man supposedly foiled the best efforts of the FBI for 35 years. Peter Butt gives the tip to 60 Minutes Australia. Smart move. The show airs simultaneously with the release of Butt's book. The highlight, a few seconds of footage of Michael Hand refusing to talk to reporters. After the show airs, Hand, through his company, Tops Knives, admits that he is now Michael Fuller, but he would consistently deny he had anything to do with the collapse of the Nugan Hand Bank. He would also claim that he was not hiding, which ironically is probably true. Michael Hand dies on November 7th, 2020, untroubled by either Australian or American authorities. Not all players in this story met with such a peaceful end. Brian Alexander, the law clerk who knew too much about the Mr. Asia gang, was allegedly thrown from a police cabin cruiser, an antique oven tied to his legs. William Colby, the former CIA director who served as legal advisor for Nugan Hand, went on a canoe trip in 1996 and never came back. Bob Gehring was a minor player in this story, a Vietnam vet working for Bernie Houghton. He owned the butcher shop, where the bank's archives were transferred. He was also the owner of the apartment used by Michael Hand during his transformation into Alan Winter. Once he was offered immunity, Gehring told Australian investigators how Michael Hand had disappeared. While on a visit to the US in 2003, Bob Gehring was found dead in a hotel bathtub. Bernie Houghton came back to Sydney in October 1981 when things cooled down. He died there in the year 2000 at age 80. His main establishment, the Bourbon and Beefsteak, remained open until 2010. In recognition for services rendered by the Bourbon and Beefsteak, the citizens of the King's Cross area erected a bust of Bernie Houghton in Fitzroy Gardens. God bless Australia.
Believe in something right, but you do something wrong. A loaded question will break your bones, what puts you on your knees. You paint the walls in red, the color of your heart, but the man